I'd like to welcome you to my ECE final project, which is a reflection of the book In Search for April Raintree. And this was a really, really powerful book and was based off of a true story, and that really impacted my engagement with the story, because when you hear a story that is somebody's life being told, you realize that, okay, there's way more to this than just the fact that somebody was creative enough to come up with this story. There's someone's history, there's someone's life behind this. And the fact that it's been put into a book really makes you think, okay, there must be something, important, like either a message or a real purpose behind why this was turned into a book that really makes you think in a different way when you're reading the book. So for me, that was one of the biggest things prior to reading the book. Now, the reason I'm doing this in video form, just so you know, is that every week I did my own written notes, and then when we came to class and did our discussions, I had a different version of my critical engagement with my classmates as I was going through my text-to-text, text-to-self, and text-to-world connections that helped me think a little bit more, understand a little bit more, develop those connections, and that's why this is going to be like a comprehensive review of everything that I've learned, but I'll still go section by section and make connections for each section. So we'll start off with the beginning of the story, and this was chapter 1 to 7, where we're talking about April's early life and what she went through. So right off the bat in the book, we find out that April's parents are unable to take care of her. She loves her little sister. She has a younger sister as well, but her parents are alcoholics and they're unable to take care of them, which eventually leads to her and her sister both being moved into foster care, and how this has impacted her life. We really, really see that in the first 7 chapters of the book. So some of the connections that I made, the direct connections that I made were, well, first, I find that my connections with time got a little bit deeper. So my first connection, as soon as I read that, and I was going out looking for a connection, I hope you understand what I mean, because when you're going out to look for a connection, you really realize that you're trying to connect anything. So I had to sometimes take a step back and be like, okay, there's a greater context of this story that I need to understand. So my first connection was pretty simple. It was that I grew up in Thornhill, Ontario, and both my elementary and high school, I had a couple of my friends who lived in foster homes, and both times they actually lived on foster homes just in my neighborhood specifically. So we used to go on the bus together. We knew them pretty well. And this one friend in particular, he was African-American, he's Black, and he always ended up moving foster homes. So basically he came from a single parent family and single father who had gone to jail. And as a kid, he was really aware of this. He didn't know why. There was a lot that was hidden from him. And so when he was in this foster homes, we used to talk to him about, because for us, as kids, a foster home was a really unique idea. We'd never heard of that. We're like, so are these your parents? Are they not? And then he would tell us, he's like, they're not my parents. They kind of just take care of me. And with time, as we were growing older, he said this one thing that I'll never forget. And he's like, I'm neither Black and I'm neither white. He's like, I really don't know what I am. And as a child, I don't think I really understood what he meant by that. But in retrospect, and I've thought about this multiple times in my education degree, is that really he didn't know because of the system that he was placed into. And I don't want to deny the fact that many foster homes are there to really help these kids. But at the end of the day, as a child, there's a big impact in your life. And so as I was reading In Search for April Raintree, I really realized that April's struggle was so similar. Because we know April struggled more than Cheryl's, I'm going to speak to hers more, at least for the beginning of the book. So for her, not being with your siblings, not having any sort of family connection, switching from house to house depending on the conditions of the house, always wondering where your parents are, always wondering if you and your family will ever be together, forming your identity. And this really got me to start thinking about what we've learned in class regarding our personal identity, and how in our early years, our personal identity, our psychosocial identity is strongly impacted by our family dynamic. And so right off the bat, I realized that okay, so when I look at April, and this kind of leads me to my text-to-text connection, where I looked at April and her constantly being moved around, and especially with the Duraciers being with a family that wasn't really taking care of her in terms of low emotional support, so low warmth and low control, which was what we've learned to be called uninvolved or indifferent parents. And it would be difficult to classify them as her parents, but they did hold that guardian role in her family. Her own parents, similarly uninvolved and indifferent. Now, in both scenarios, the case is very different. So, for example, with her own parents, there was a lot of history behind what happened to them, and I'll speak to that in a second. But with her foster parents, especially at the Duraciers, not the Dionnes were pretty good to her, but at the Duraciers, I hope I'm saying the name correctly, but at their place, they really just wanted a foster child to be able to be their worker almost. And that was really evidently seen in many scenarios where they made her clean the small bedroom they gave her, the way she was treated, the way the kids at school would bully her. So much had happened that really, really like shows you that there is a lot of emotional, psychosocial harm that's being done on her. So that immediately started to make me realize that, okay, there's a bigger story to this, right? And that when I look at text to text, we've learned that when uninvolved and no warmth or low warmth parents are with the child, they're the most impacted among all different types of parenting methods. And so already that was really difficult. And then this text to text connection kind of led me to a greater idea that I already started seeing. Now, being an ed student, and that too in my final semester of my degree, I have been exposed a lot more now than ever about the history of colonization, the legacy of colonization, all the horrible things that were done to First Nations families. And now it's interesting because when you hear all this in theory in a classroom and you have like a discussion about it, you believe it happened. And you believe that you want to be a part of that change so that, as future educators, we educate our students about this history. But at the same time, you don't really hear personal, individualized stories. So it wasn't until I read April Raintree, especially like right at the beginning, where I started to already think about the effects that colonization had in April's life. So let's look off right from the beginning. Her parents, her family dynamic, them being alcoholics, them being difficult for them to support their children, not having, from what it seems like in the beginning of the book, not having some sort of sufficient job to take care of those children, right? So right from that, you start seeing that, okay, colonization wasn't too long ago, right? So the intergenerational trauma that is caused by colonization is still continuously affecting these families. Like when we look at the last residential school being closed in 1996, we know that there's way more to the solution for this than to think that, oh, we've come past that. It's not. This is intergenerational. So even down generations, it's going to impact them, right? In fact, how long it took colonization to happen is going to take way longer than to be able to overcome it. But obviously, and I'll speak to this later on, that there's a lot of things that we can do, but I think that's as a reflection near the end. So already that was another text to world connection that I started having right away. And then this kind of continued throughout the rest of my text to world connections, where the idea of colonization, the effects of colonization really, really stuck with me. And that being said, then being put in foster homes and living with other parents was another difficult part of colonization, where the dominant group became white families. And because of that, when April or Cheryl would go to any home, they had to assimilate according to those families. So already we're seeing a weak nature-nurture combination happening here, where their biological effects biological background had already impacted their life in one way. And then we look at the nurture they were getting, and maybe at the Dionnes, especially April, was being treated well for a while, but then the second she went to the Duraciers, it was horrible treatment. And when she's already somebody who is half white and half First Nations, she's already struggling with an internal battle of role confusion, right? Like, who is she? Role identity confusion as well, where she's not understanding, who am I? Where is my place in this? Where's my place in this world? Where's my place in this family? Where's my place in all of these different institutions that she's a part of, right? Where's my place in school? All of those, especially speaking to her self-confidence, with that already being low, you can continuously see this theme of her being unhappy of the part of her that's First Nations. So it's really important that we critically look and try to understand, dig deeper as to why that's the case. There's a history behind this, right? And then one more text-to-text connection that I made was that when I was in my pre-internship, I read the book Fatty Legs, and that's a really, really impactful book to read to your students about the history of colonization in residential schools, because when you read Fatty Legs, you realize that it's very, very difficult for these families to overcome what they did, but for you to understand that you have to know the history behind it. So when you find out what happened in residential schools, when you find out what happened to these families, when you find out how they were stripped of their identity, you really start to understand why parents or grandparents are unable to form a family connection, are unable to support their family in all the different ways, the financial, emotional, among other aspects of why that support is lacking, right? There's a history behind it. There's something that happened behind it. Their identity has been lost, and they really have constantly been put into the lower socioeconomic statuses. So all of these things like come together. So Fatty Legs was one of those books that for me, text to text right away connected, where it was both are talking about the effects of colonization, but one's really giving you the history behind colonization. So almost it made me think that if I was in a classroom, especially with middle years, I would, depending on the middle year grade I was in, but if I was in grade 8 or 9, I would right away start talking about Fatty Legs first, have them read that first so that they understand the history behind this. And then when they would read Raintree, they would really understand that what happened in Fatty Legs, the effects of that are still occurring, right? So for them to be able to kind of see that parallel and make those connections is important. And so for me, that was a connection that stood out to me most, because right away I started seeing effects of colonization in both, but this one I'm seeing the one that's less obvious, because the effects in Fatty Legs almost, you know that's going to happen because you keep being given details of the specifics that's happening. Versus in this scenario, you realize that, wow, it was not long ago. It's still affecting these families. It's still affecting these individuals. And so we as a society need to bring some sort of change. Again, I'll get to that in a little bit more detail. So this brings me to check-in number 2, which was chapters 8 to 14. And in chapter 8 to 14, we find out constantly April's progression of her disliking her Métis side, disliking her First Nation side, and really wanting to identify as white, because she believes that the sole root and cause of majority of her problems is the fact that she's First Nations. Again, a very, very sad and very, very sad. I don't think I have another word for it, but unfortunate circumstances that she's been put into where she constantly believes this. And for me, that's where my first right away text to self connection came, where she specifically says this quote that there were 2 different groups of children that went to the park. One group was the brown-skinned children who look like Cheryl in most ways. The other group was the fair-skinned, and I used to envy them, especially the girls with blonde hair and blue eyes. And her not feeling a place. And again, like I said, I grew up in Thornhill, Ontario, which is a very white-dominant town. And all my friends, majority of my classmates were white, and all I wanted when I was growing up was to be white. Like, there was nothing I wanted more than that, because the culture and the background and the religion and everything I came from was quote unquote stricter than white families. And so I really wanted to have white parents. I really wanted to have a white family. I really wanted to be white, to have more freedom, to have more decision-making skills, to have more, like, whatever standard my friends had given me, I wanted all that. And I thought the only way to get that is to be white. And then as I started growing up a little bit, and the main concern in your life becomes like the way you look and the way you dress or how you feel, right? Like, and all that, all the kids in our class used to say that the prettier girls are the blonde hair, blue-eyed girls. And I just remember vividly that in my late middle years, my early high school, just really, really wanting to be white. I am embarrassed to say this, but I have had times for a really long time where I've put creams on my face so that I can get paler, so that I can look more white, because even in my own country, white is the standard of beauty, right? And so when your identity is being created at that time, you're really impacted by those things that you hear continuously, constantly being reinforced, and especially when you see that that's the normal, that's the dominant, you really want to be that, right? Like naturally as kids, we're inclined to want to be that. And when April says that that's constantly what she wants, I like completely understand that. And that when she sees her struggles as being a barrier because of the fact that she's First Nations, I felt that too. Like I felt like my struggles had a lot to do with the fact that, you know, I was a brown-skinned Pakistani Muslim girl. And I never used to wear a scarf then. I knew that for me, I never wanted anybody to identify me as anything but white. I remember that I had, well, not I remember, I still do have really curly hair. And I remember me and my sister for days, like we would wake up early in the morning before high school. I would put my head on the bed and have my hair out, and she would be ironing it with an iron, and we would be smelling this burning smell, but it didn't matter because you know what? I'd rather have the straight hair like all the other girls in my grade than to not feel a part. So my social identity at that point in my life was super affected by this. Now going back to April and Cheryl, both of them, I can imagine, first of all, experiencing something way more difficult than I did because they were constantly being moved around, because they didn't have each other all the time. At this part of the book, they somewhat have each other, but this chapter 8 to 14 is actually such a widespread of information, because in the beginning, they're still in her transition. April meets a guy, a lot is going on. And then in the ending, something really horrible happens. And that really changes the story from then on. So before I get to that, I kind of just want to close up on my text to self, where, again, one of the things that April says, and I want to read another quote that really spoke to me, was that she said, I can't accept being Métis. That's the hardest thing I've ever had to say to you, Cheryl. And I'm glad that you don't feel the same way I do. I'm so proud of what you're trying to do. And that really speaks to the fact that she, at least in the beginning portion of this check-in, was that she really didn't want to identify as that. And that really connected with me. But then as the chapter went on and unraveled, and her history started unfolding, and seeing how Cheryl changed, her aspirations changed, her alcohol abuse, it really opens your eyes to the fact that there's a lot of history behind this. And so this kind of brings me into, first I'll speak about my text-to-text connection, which I made with our class portion, where Erikson's theory of psychosocial development in terms of Cheryl is super affected because she's having identity versus role confusion, and she doesn't know where she fits in within a greater context. And so she keeps resorting back to options that are harming her more than they're doing good. And it's not until later on in the book that we realize why she's doing what she's doing. And again, it really starts to, make you start thinking about text to world, where once again, colonization's effects have put her in this position, have made her feel this way, have made her social positioning this way, has made her less privileged in this world. Last week in class, we spoke about privilege, and we realized that your privilege really impacts the stage of life that you're in, and what power you have to do anything. And one thing that we had in one of our group discussions that really spoke to me was that we spoke about how no one of power ever made either of the girls, besides possibly the Dion family way in the beginning, made these girls feel like they were important, that they belonged, that they could make a difference in someone's life. You know, it was just each other really that they had. So in Erikson's theory, she's already super affected by the fact that she doesn't know where she belongs. And so she's put in this already the social confusion of who her identity is, where she belongs, and her background. Another text-to-text connection that I made for this portion of the book is a article that I found called The Beginning and End of Rape, Confronting Sexual Violence in Native America. So this text-to-text connection was later on in this portion of our check-in, where we find out that April gets raped, and it's just such a sad story. When you read it, really, you have goosebumps. You realize that this is the reality for so many women out there. And when you realize this is a true story, you begin to realize more that there's something really messed up with our society that something like this continues on. And, you know, when I was doing this connection and I read this article, it was so sad to see that so many women in North America, Native women, First Nations women in North America, still experience rape at such a high level compared to the rest of the country because of the history they've been through. And a quote from this article that really spoke to me said, I'm going to read it to you, that rape against Native women is not an epidemic. Epidemics are social. In fact, it's political and historical. And I think that speaks volumes of realizing the effects of colonization and how much it's impacted First Nations families and First Nations women, and how we can't look at them and be like, you need to come out of your situation. You know, we're past that stage. No, there's a political and historical basis behind why this is happening. And for Cheryl, for example, to go into becoming a prostitute means that something in her life put her to the level that she had to choose that route as opposed to something else, you know? Later on in the story, we find out obviously she has a child, she has to support, so that's what happens. And whoever this group of men is that rapes April, they've misidentified her to be Cheryl. Now, the concerning part is that they're so unimpacted by what happened and what they're doing because it's a First Nations woman, and that's okay. And so for me, that again gave me so much goosebumps, and the explanation in that portion of the reading is really, really detailed and really disturbing, and the way the rape happens and the lack of remorse for anyone but that driver, really scary, really sad, really disturbed me. And the fact that, you know, after the man peed in her mouth and she rinsed it out and she went to the doctor for help, you know, that disgust and that disappointment in the doctor for her rinsing out her mouth, you know, not taking into account that she'd need to, you know, check the DNA, was so unfair, right? It was so unfair. Like, this girl, like, right now, the one thing she needs is compassion. The one thing she needs is support. And it really makes you question and wonder whether she's not receiving that support because she's a First Nations lady, and that's something that's common, right? Now, thankfully, in the book, the rapists do get convicted and they have to deal with the consequences of what happened. That is really nice to see that some sort of justice, I would not even say a fraction of it, but some sort of justice has happened. But those portions of the book really, really hurt your heart and really make you realize that colonization, rape of women was happening then. And so it's historical. And the political aspect of it is the fact that governments still haven't done enough to bring that change, right? Yeah, in Canada, I can admit that we have the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which is amazing, but that's not enough. More needs to happen. And again, I'll kind of sum this up near the ending, but one of the starts and something that we have in control is the education system. And I guess I'll speak to that in a little bit. But I'm just going to move on to my text to world connection for this portion, which was, for me, this was the rapes that happened in India. Specifically, this one rape that happened a couple of years back with a lady going on a train, and it was a gang rape. And it's just so horrifying, that story. They raped her. They beat her up after. Very similar. When I was reading that portion in April Raintree, that connection was constantly coming back because I had really kept up to date with that story, and it really, really pained me. It really hurt me listening to that story and seeing how harmful, how unfortunate that story was. And throughout April Raintree, I kept being brought back to that story where those men gang raped her on a train. She was just going home back to see her family. And that because she was a woman, because she was alone, they assumed that she was somebody who could be taken advantage of, and that was okay, and that their morals and values didn't teach them anything else, and their respect for women and the historical basis behind this also didn't teach them anything. So for me, just seeing how real it is was so sad. And the woman in India actually died. But I don't know how to phrase this, but when I was listening to April's after effects of the rape, it makes you so sad to think that in one scenario, for example, the woman in India, she died. And that's a horrible, 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 sad thing. But April wasn't living a life anymore either, right? She wasn't living a life that was positive. She wasn't living a life that she was able to ever forget what had happened. And thank God for the support that she eventually had and in her partner. But again, as the story unraveled, that support wasn't enough because a lot of other things were happening in her life. And again, we have to understand the history behind that and the privilege that goes into. I've always find that with privilege, I know that with privilege comes oppression, and she's a part of the group that's oppressed, right? And she's a part of the group that's really constantly affected by that. So this takes me to the last portion of the book, was chapter 15 to 17. And the connections I'll make here, I'll try to make them a little bit quicker because I can imagine that you're probably getting bored of me at this point. But I'm going to try to make these concise, but really, really speak to what difference they made when I was reading this portion. So in the text-to-text part of the my reflection, right away, this made me want to search up some CTV news articles about suicide. Or not CTV, that's the one I actually ended up finding. But it made me want to search up statistics in Canada behind suicide. And the reason is because at this portion of the book, April's sister Cheryl commits suicide, and it really makes you think, okay, there's a history behind First Nation suicide. And so I first went to find, these statistics, and I'd like to read some of them out to you so that, it kind of puts things in perspective for you. But this article talks about comparison of First Nations versus the general population. And the number of adults that report either moderate or high levels of psychological distress among First Nations is 51%. That's a lot. Among the rest of the population is 33.5%. Among adults reporting suicide ideation at some point in their lifetime for First Nations, it's 22%. And for the general population, it's 9%. Again, a big, big discrepancy, especially when you look at the fraction of First Nations people in Canada compared to the rest of the population. Like 22% is a lot more than the 9% that we're looking at, right? And then the actual First Nations suicide rate versus the non-Aboriginal population, you find that in both males and females, it's higher for First Nations people. So it's the suicide rate for 100,000 people for males is 126 versus for non-Aboriginals, it's 24. And for females, it's 35 Aboriginals females committing suicide to every 5 non-Aboriginal females committing suicide. That's really, really, really scary, and that's really sad. And these stats are very recent. I want to tell you exactly 2018 they're from. So that's so sad that our world is still in a situation where we have made them oppressed over and over again, and our society has failed to make a proper impact, right? So for these three connections, the majority of my focus will be on the suicide, but I do want to connect this to as well, again, our text, where now that I'm kind of reflecting on the whole book, especially after the third section, you really realize nature and nurture here, and how much of a difference it makes, because whatever they went through in their childhood and the impact of their childhood life had long-lasting effects, impacted their entire life, their identity. The way they had been nurtured really impacted the path they took in life, really impacted the fact that, they weren't able to like, for example, Cheryl, who wanted to do something successful in her life and went on the wrong path because of her nurturing, because of her political and historical history as well. Like, there's so many different aspects of society and institutions within our society that impacted her to live that life, really, right? It's very institutionalized. And so that for me was, those two are my text-to-text connections. And then for my text to self, when I was thinking about this point, I was like, I really don't want to sit here and pretend like I've gone through anything remotely similar. So I'm not going to say that this is a text to self direct connection I can make. Definitely not. But I'm thinking of, in my life, I've had 3 scenarios actually up until now where I've had friends who wanted to commit suicide. One, the first time this happened, it was very, very scary. Basically, I'd gotten a text message from a friend, and right away I started calling her. She's not picking up. I'm calling her sister-in-law, her brother, everyone I can get a hold of. And then she texted me back. She's like, hey, I sent you that text months ago and I never really went through with it. And I like went to her house that night. I was like, what is going on? Like, are you okay? What happened? Like, even back then, I don't know why I got it so late. And she just told me, she's like, I'm just unhappy with my life, and I just don't have anyone to talk to. I don't have a support system. And what we learn in our class is your support systems are so important, especially being in your early years. Your parents, your guardians, your school, your education system, your friends, your relationship, your social relationships. And those weren't strong. And when we look at Bronfenbrenner's ecological systems theory, we see that the micro, macro, meso, they all need to be connected for them to be as strong as they can. But for these girls, for April and Cheryl, none of them were connected, right? So they had no strength in these bonds in anything, right? Their institutions were all so broken for them that they weren't able to overcome their trauma because of that. So this leads me to speak about the 2 other friends I was going to tell you. Is that they're both friends of mine in the middle years program, and both just struggling with the expectations of society, making money, living in the society that it's so difficult that they wanted to pick that route. And for me, it was scary to see that, so firsthand. And again, I don't think that's the same thing as what April and Cheryl went through and what Cheryl did, but definitely it did bring some sort of connection in realizing that our institutions make such a big impact on people's life, and made me help relate our course material where what happens in your child's life and society as a whole really impacts, I guess, us as adults and in the long run. And then the last connection that I'll make for this section is the L'Orange suicides. A couple years back, again, very, very sad, tragic story of the L'Orange suicides where several girls, young girls, committed suicide in hopes to wake up the world and teach the world that there is so much happening to First Nations families. There's so much happening, so much injustice. Up until now, the effects of colonization are not gone, and their families are so broken and hurt, and their identities are so impacted by this that they thought that they even in their suicide notes, they expressed this, that if we commit suicide, we're hoping this brings some sort of change. And they had this discussion that, we found out, like later if you look into those articles, that they made a pact that, if I commit suicide, you have to too, so that we can make a bigger social impact. And these things is unfortunately, they make a social impact for the time that they're there, and then they're so easily forgotten. And so when I read, the portion of this reading when Cheryl commits suicide, and I realized like all the historical, political history behind her decision, it just blows your mind away. Like there's so many stressors that are involved in her life because of her history, because of colonization, because of residential schools, because of First Nations identity being stripped away from them, that made her and the women and the young girls in L'Orange do what they do. Really, really should wake us up, right? And so I'm sorry this has been such a long video for you, but this really brings me to my last, I would say, all around connection. I wouldn't really call it a specific connection, but all this had made me as somebody who truly, truly, truly aspires to be a reflective practitioner, and somebody who looks at everything that I read and I study. I'm so sorry, even my phone is done with me. So I'm going to wrap it up quickly, but to say that my entire connection with this and looking at these, at being a reflective practitioner, thinking about all this, has really made me realize, and also made me wonder why you wanted us to read this, is that we as future educators need to acknowledge, educate the privilege and oppression that occurs in our society, the history in our society, the history of colonization, the effects of the effects that First Nations families had to deal with, for us to truly make an impact, because we are one institution in this society that can make a difference, and because we're the future educators, we need to think about what we can do. Beyond that, even in a social justice standpoint, we need to stand up and make sure that that although, yes, we have the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, amazing. Now, if parts of that aren't working, we need to bring change. We need to figure out what we need to do next. How can we help out First Nations families, First Nations individuals, right from a young age, as we've learned in this class. Everything about your identity starts impacting you since the day you're born, since the day you get exposed to this world, since the day you get exposed to different institutions in this world, your family, your school system, all the different levels that Bronfenbrenner speaks about. All those different levels need to be strong for everyone in the society. And the first, people that we need to focus on right now is First Nations families. And this really makes me realize that that's something that I want to focus on, and I hope you do too, and I hope all of us future educators, we do that. And thank you so much for listening to me for this long. I am so sorry I took so much of your time, but this book really spoke to me in many ways, and I wanted to make sure you were able to hear all my connections. I still had a couple more, I kind of had to omit them, but thank you so much, and we'll see you soon.